9 waves have crashed upon the shore, 9 waves have crashed and 9 waves more, since the days of which we speak. Days when the Fianna, the great, bold, fierce, wild warriors of ancient Ireland, like a band of wolves, like a herd of young stags clashing in the summer, would gather upon the hills of Ireland on a bright, beautiful summer's day like it was on that very day, and they would look out across the lands, across hills and valleys, to mountains, to moors, to the sea coast, to the forests and thickets, to the peat bogs, to all manner of the lands of Ireland. And they would see where help was needed, and they would run like the wind to go and help the people of Ireland from all that might threaten them. And it was on one such summer's day that they looked out and saw coming towards them from the direction of the Brún na Boyne, the great Iron Age mound that is upon the banks of the Boyne River, that was built in ancient times by the Dagda himself, the great fierce king of the gods, and passed from him to his son Angus MacCog, the god of love, and from him to another, to another, to another, to another, until it passed into the general keeping of all and sundry, and was known thence as New Grange. They saw coming from the direction of the Brún na Boyne a warrior bold and bright and beautiful. And at first they couldn't recognise him, he was so far off, but the closer he got, the sooner they realised that this was Cael, the foster son of Finn MacCool, leader of the Fianna. And they welcomed him in with grand gestures, and Cael came towards them, and Finn came out and embraced and hugged his foster son as close to him as he was to his own biological sons. And there was feasting and drinking and celebrating that the two were reunited, not only Finn and Cael, but Cael and his many friends, his brothers in the band of warriors. And at length they asked where he'd been, and he said he had indeed been at the Brún na Boyne, there to meet with one of the ancient women of the hills, a woman by the name of Muireann. And the name seemed familiar to Finn. He couldn't place it quite, but he knew this name, and he asked who Muireann was. And Cael confirmed that Muireann was the now ancient woman, once young woman, who had raised him and nurtured him and looked after him as an infant, his nurse, his carer, his guardian and protector, who had been by his side throughout his childhood and into his youth, and whom he still, even now, as a man, would go and visit, for she was as close to him as any aunt might expect to be. And why, asked Finn, have you gone to see Muireann? Ah, said Cael, I seek her advice, for she is perhaps the wisest of the wise women. There is little which she does not know, particularly when it comes to the matters of the people of the other world, the Sidhe, the people of peace, the people of the strange lands that dwell alongside us. And of course Finn MacCool and all of his men knew exactly who Cael was talking about, for the Sidhe are that mysterious other race that populate Ireland, often glimpsed but never quite fully seen. And why is it that you need information about the Sidhe? Well, said Cael, I have long been dreaming of a woman of the Sidhe, a woman by the name of Credhe. We have heard of Credhe, everyone has heard of Credhe, said Finn and the men of the Fianna. For she is famed for her immense wealth. She is said to be the trickiest of women, the cunningest of women, for she has inveigled out of the possession of every king, of every druid, of every chieftain, of every warrior, of every man, and indeed every woman of standing the length and breadth of Ireland, countless treasures, until her own palace is filled to the brim with gold and silver and rubies and pearls and emeralds and diamonds and sapphires, of shields and swords and goblets, of pendants, of chalices, of rings, of crowns, of all manner of extravagant treasures that she has inveigled away from others. And it is said, said Finn, looking at the blush that had come into the cheek of his foster son Cael, it is said that she refuses to marry any man save one who can recite the entire contents of her ever-growing treasury. And not just as some dull, dry list of goods, but to recite them in poetry. For she wishes to be wooed by a man who is bright of mind as well as strong of arm, and quick of wit as well as quick of sword. Many have tried, and all have failed. This, said Cael, is why I have gone to see Murin, for she, I am sure, being the wisest of the wise women, knows all of the goods, the treasures, the precious things that are to be found in the treasury of Credhe. And we have sat many a long hour drinking mead, and she has told me of each and every treasure of which she knows, and I have encapsulated the essence of each treasure in a verse, in a line of poetry, and strung the lines together like pearls upon a string. And now I go to present this necklace of pearls to Credhe herself, to see if she will marry me, for I have long dreamt of marrying her, and her image, her dream self, her Aisling, has troubled me often and often and often. And Finn asked if he could be an audience for his foster son to practice the recitation of this poem before he should go off with the full blessings of Finn. And this Cael did. He recited verse after verse after verse after verse, listing each and every treasure in the cleverest and cunningest of ways, with puns and plays upon words, of imagery counter-positioned against imagery, until every man in the band of the Fianna sat open-mouthed upon the grass, listening to this recitation, amazed both by the extent of Credhe's treasury, but also the wit and wordplay of their brother in arms. And at length, when the last line of the poem was done, all of the men jumped to their feet and they applauded and said this surely would win the heart of Credhe, as no other attempt to do so had ever done. And they gave him mead, and they gave him food for the journey, and they slapped him on the back, and they sent him on his way with their full support and praise. And off Cael went. He went mile after mile after mile, stopping here and there to gain guidance on the next stage of the journey from passers-by. On and on and on he went into the mountains, until at length he came to the great palace of Credhe and beat upon the door. And the gate guardians asked him who he was and what he wanted, and he told them he had come to woo Credhe. And they looked at him as if to say, "You and how many others?" But such was the guidance that the Queen had laid down upon them, that they ushered him into the royal court. And Credhe looked him up and down with not a little surprise, for just as Cael had been dreaming of Credhe for many a long month, so she had been dreaming of a young man whose name she did not know. But here he was in the flesh before her, as handsome and brave and bold and quick-witted as the man of whom she had dreamed all those long months. And she said to him, "Can you name my treasury? Can you recite it to me in words as beautiful as the treasures themselves, in words as lasting as the treasures themselves? And this Cael did. He recited the poem to her that he had recited to his foster father and his brothers in the Fianna. And at the end of it, just the same as the warriors of the Fianna had done, the court leapt to their feet, having listened open-mouthed to this wondrous recitation. They applauded, they cheered, they danced, for at last their queen had found a man worthy of her, her equal in knowledge and understanding. And a great celebration was held, and she opened her arms and embraced him, the man she had come to love. And they were indeed married. Now it has to be said that in the lands of the Sidhe, time is not as it is in the lands of we mere mortals. Sometimes a day in the lands of the Sidhe can be a century in the lands of mortality. But at other times, a century in the lands of the Sidhe can be a mere hour in the lands of mortal kind, for the nature of time is all a bit wibbly-wobbly and timey-wimey, and all over the place. It comes and it goes, it pitches and it flows, and you never quite know where you are. And how long Cael and Credhe spent together in the great halls and palaces of the Sidhe is hard to say. It may have been many a long year in the lands of the Sidhe, but in the lands of mere mortal kind it was scarcely more than a week. And when at length Cael said to Credhe that he would like her to meet with his family, to meet with his foster father, to meet with his blood kin, that he would like to take her on a tour of the lands of the mortals, just as she had taken him on a tour of her fairy hall, they began upon their journey. With their retinue, of course, not just the two of them. The servants came as well, as they always do. They journeyed far and they journeyed wide, and they came at length to the places where the Fianna normally dwell during the summer months, and there they found hardly anyone at all. A few warriors left to guard the buildings, and when they asked where Finn was, when they asked where the Fianna was, the guardians told them that a great and terrible fate had befallen Ireland within a matter of days. And the fate of Ireland was this, and we have told the tale in this place before, many a long year ago. The tale of how Dara Don, the self-proclaimed king of the world, had arrived on the shores of Ireland with an enormous fleet of ships, huge ships, the like of which had never been seen in Ireland before, and each ship weighed down with a great platoon of warriors armed to the very teeth. And how Dara Don, the king of the world, had sent his emissaries across to Ireland, chiefly in the person of Fianna, his right-hand man, to bear message to the peoples of Ireland, chiefly as represented by Finn and the Fianna, saying that if Ireland would crook its knee and bend its neck to the king of the world, the way every other country he had gone to had done, and become part of the vast and sprawling empire of the king of the world, then the Irish would be left in peace, aside, of course, from the need to pay annual tribute to the king of the world, and they would have become part of the biggest empire the world had ever known. But of course at once Finn and the Fianna sent back telling the king of the world precisely what he could do with his offer of submission to his empire, that the Irish would submit to no one, least of all some self-proclaimed king-emperor. And at once, as soon as that message had been delivered to Daire Don, the Fianna, sitting up upon the hills looking down upon the white strand, for such had that bay, that beach been called, so white and pure and glistening was the sand that stretched the length of the beach where the ships were moored. But they could see leaving that vast fleet of huge ships an even vaster fleet of smaller boats, rowing boats, bringing the warriors armed and beating their swords against their shields, howling and roaring and calling with their strange foreign battle cries. Ship after ship, boat after boat, coming from the left and from the right, swarming towards them like a great plague. They came and they came and they came. And this, the guardians of the houses of the Fianna explained to Credhe and Cael. They came by the hundreds, they came by the thousands, they came more often than there are stars in the skies. They came like a swarm of wasps, plaguing and stinging and attacking the people of Ireland. And the warriors of the Fianna, brave as they were so much smaller in number than this great swarming army of the kings of the world. But they fought, each one of them like 100 men, hacking and slashing and ripping and tearing. Day after day the blood of the Fianna stained the white sands, and the blood of the armies of the king of the world stained the white sands until the white sands were red sands. And each night the druids of the Fianna would go along the battlefields and find the wounded and the injured and take them back to the encampment in the hills and use their potions and their unguents and their spells and their enchantments to restore the injured Fianna to full health and fighting fit. But of course, amongst the wounded were also the dead, and the number of dead grew day upon day upon day. And the druids, gifted in magic though they were, could not restore the dead to life. And the tide began to turn in favour of the vast armies of the king of the world. We have told in this very place before of the strategies used by the king of the world, by both the king of the world to fight his side of the battles, but also by the Fianna to fight their side of the battles, to turn the tides of this dread spectacle, of how they'd called upon Manannán Clear, who had whipped up a great ocean tide, a great wave, a great storm that had sunk ship after ship after ship in the fleet, until the bodies of the warriors of the king of the world littered the ocean bed. But enough of the ships had survived to still significantly outnumber the Fianna. But in that great tumult, enough damage had been done by Manannán Clear, the god of the ocean wave, that the tide of battle had been turned, and the Fianna were able to rally their strength, call upon their druids to not only use their magic for healing, but for taking part in the battle as well. And slowly but slowly the tide had begun to turn. And hearing all of this, of course, Cael, a great warrior himself, fearing for the life of his foster father, fearing for the life of all of his brothers in arms, said to his wife that, love her as he did, he must go and fight. And she, of course, would not see him do anything other, for she had married a brave, fierce man, not a coward. And she went with him, for she was as much a warrior woman as he was a warrior man. And at last, after a long journey, they arrived at what had once been called the White Strand, but could be called it no longer. And there they saw the blood and the death and the carnage. They heard the raucous croaking of the crows and the carrion birds waiting to feed. They heard the howling of the wolves in the mountains waiting to feed upon the dead. They heard the wolf-like battle cries of the Fianna themselves, throwing back their heads and howling as they descended, clashing shield upon shield, sword upon sword, axe upon axe, spear upon spear, fighting and fighting and fighting with the ever-dwindling armies of the King of the World. And there Cael raced himself, swinging his sword left and right, hacking and tearing and ripping. Day after day after day he fought alongside his brethren and his foster father, and slowly but slowly but slowly the armies of the King of the World were reduced and reduced and reduced, until at last, on the final fatal day, Cael himself, leader of the Fianna, though badly, grievously injured from countless wounds, came face to face with the King of the World himself, who, up until this point, had been safely ensconced on the biggest ship in his fleet, but now, seeing the tide of battle turning until he was this close to losing, had decided that he must rally his troops by coming onto the field of battle and wielding a sword himself. The two great leaders clashed and they fought, hour after hour after hour, hacking and tearing and ripping and slashing, until at length, Cael hacked off with one blow the left foot of the King of the World, and with a second blow took off the head of the King of the World, and it went bouncing across the field of battle. We have told in this place many a year ago of what happened when the King of the World's daughter saw her father beheaded, but that tale does not need retelling now. Suffice it to say that when Fianna, the right-hand man of the King of the World, saw his liege lord who had conquered 3/4 of the known world lying dead in his own blood, he rushed forward and snatched the crown from the severed head and took it to the next highest ranking warrior in that army, and placed the crown upon his head. And another of the Fianna leapt forward and did battle with that man, and fought and fought and fought until that head was severed, and the crown shifted to another, and the battle continued as another Fianna fought and fought and fought, until that man fell dead, and there was none left to whom the crown could be given. And indeed there were almost none left at all, for the soldiers of the King of the World were either dead or so grievously injured they soon would be, lying in their own blood in this field of carnage. And the only two left standing were the King of the World's daughter, who in her madness ran into the mountains never to be seen again for many a century, and Fianna himself, that right-hand man. And he took up the crown and rushed towards the shore, crying over his shoulder that he would take word to the rest of the armies of the King of the World, which were ensconced in the various conquered territories. For this army, this great swarm of warriors that they had battled and battled and battled, was but, he claimed, 1/10 of the legions that the King of the World would command. And though the king was dead, the crown would in time pass to another, and they would be back to finish the job. For now they knew the strengths and the weaknesses of the people of Ireland. And saying that, Fianna jumped into a rowboat, and having no servant, for they were all dead, rowed himself back out to the biggest of the ships, where a handful of sailors still left standing were getting the ship ready to sail away. And Cael threw back his head and roared, for he was in a grievous state of injury, terribly wounded from his battle with the King of the World, and said if he but had the strength he would go after Fianna, for what a terrible thing it would be for this whole great battle to start all over again in a few months or a few years, for whoever the new King of the World would one day become, to bring more armies back to finish the job that this dead King of the World had started. But all of the men of the Fianna were as grievously wounded as the men of the king of the world. They too were bloodied and battled and injured and limping around. And they looked from one to another, and Fianna asked his own closest man, Fergus, to find someone, anyone who could help. And Fergus, limping and wounded and bleeding from his own injuries, shuffled around the battlefield looking for someone, anyone who could help, until at length he came to Cael. And Cael could just about manage to stand on 2 feet, and he heard tell the worries of his foster father, and he said to Fergus, "Help me to the shore. I shall swim out after this right-hand man." And Fergus at once tried to take off his armour, but Cael said, "Leave the armour on, leave the helmet on, for I fear the only thing keeping my body together, keeping my organs within me, is this suit of armour, this helmet. If you were to take them off, my innards would spill. There are so many wounds upon my body. My brains would leak out. There are so many fractures and injuries to my head." And so Fergus put an arm round his shoulder, and they limped down to the waters and waded out as far as Fergus could go. And Cael dived into the ocean, swimming with all of the skill of a dolphin, out towards the greatest of the ships, where, as his head crested the wave, he could just see the wooden rowboat coming alongside, and Fianna beginning to climb up the rope ladder that was put down for him. And so he swam the faster and the faster and the faster, until at length he came to the rowboat itself, crested the waves and called out Fianna's name. And Fianna, assuming this must be one of his fellow warriors from his own side, because his name was being called, looked down and reached down a hand to take hold of the swimmer and help pull him up. And it was only when their hands gripped that Fianna saw that this swimmer was not one of his own men, had not the cast and look of a warrior of the King of the World, but was one of the Irish. And with the last of his strength, Cael hauled on the arm and tore Fianna from the rope ladder, who crashed into the ocean waves, and Cael embraced him as tightly as he could. And the 2 men, weighed down by their armour, by the exhaustion of their bodies, for whilst Fianna had few wounds, there was enough to wear him out. And struggle and struggle and struggle and thrash as he would, waters bubbling and boiling around them, the 2 men sank to the bottom of the ocean wave, to the very bed and sand at the base of the ocean, and there they died. And so the fleet of the King of the World, those ships that still had any sailors on them, what could they do? They could not go home without their crew, without their warriors and their captains, not without facing death themselves. They stayed in Ireland, and in time they gave all of the treasures upon their ships as compensation and blood money to the Fianna. But that is another story. For upon the beach, the battle now ended. The wives, the sisters, the mothers, the daughters, the young children of the warriors who had been watching the battle from far off came down, their faces streaked with tears, sobbing and wailing, some with relief to see that their men, though injured, had survived, and others filled with grief to see their men dead upon the field of battle. And amongst the women was Credhe herself, come to find her husband, for she had not witnessed him going out to the ocean wave and had no idea what had happened. And she called and she called and she called, and she turned over one body after another, each time fearing to see the face of her husband, maybe blooded and injured, maybe dead. And at length she bumped into Fergus, and Fergus explained all that had happened. And the heart of Credhe began to race and race and race and race, and she ran down to the seashore, seeing something moving in the wave. And there she and Fergus found the drowned body of Cael washed up ashore. And Credhe threw back her head and screamed with grief, howled with grief. Between her and Fergus, they were able to carry the body up onto the beach, beyond the beach to the place where the honoured dead were being buried. And all night, Credhe sat by the body, her shawl drawn up around her head, covering her hair, in the gesture of grief known since ancient times, and she keened and she keened and she keened in a way that the she-women alone can do. And her sorrow carried itself all around Ireland, and the she all around Ireland heard her weeping and keening, and they joined in. And the servants dug the graves, and when the body of Cael was laid in his grave, in the early hours of dawn, Credhe crawled in, lay down beside him, closed her eyes, and died of grief. And the two of them were buried there, and remain there from that day to this. Their love sealed in the grave as it was sealed in life.